The icy water reached her knees before Beatrice Calloway realized she was going to die out here alone. She had been crossing what should have been a shallow creek bed when the winter storm surge came roaring down from the mountains like God's own fury, transforming the trickling stream into a churning monster that knocked her feet from under her and sent her scrambling for purchase on the slippery rocks. Her wagon had overturned 50 yards back, her horse had bolted in terror, and now the freezing December water of 1873 was rising so fast she could barely keep her head above the surface as she clung to a twisted cottonwood root jutting from the muddy bank. Her fingers were already numb, her heavy wool dress dragging her down like an anchor. She had been traveling alone from Omaha to Nebraska City to start her new position as a school teacher, a decision her mother had called foolish and her father had reluctantly supported because Beatrice had always been the stubborn one. The daughter who read too many books and dreamed too many dreams about independence and adventure. Now those dreams were drowning along with her in water so cold it felt like knives slicing through her skin. She tried to pull herself up the bank, but her fingers slipped on the icy mud and she plunged back into the water, gasping as it closed over her head. When she surfaced, coughing and choking, the current had pulled her several feet downstream. Her chest burned with the effort of breathing, and she knew she had minutes at best before hypothermia took her consciousness. The winter sun was already sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the flooded prairie, and she thought about how they would find her body when spring came, if they found it at all. Then she heard the sound of hooves pounding through water. At first she thought it was a hallucination, her oxygen-starved brain conjuring impossible rescue, but the sound grew louder, and then she saw him. A rider on a big roan horse charging through the flood with water spraying up around them like wings, and she wanted to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. He was close enough now that she could see his face beneath the brim of his hat, hard and focused, his eyes scanning the churning water until they locked on her. "Hold on!" His voice cut through the roar of the flood. "I'm coming to you!" He guided his horse closer, the animal snorting and fighting the current, but responding to his commands with the trust that came from years of partnership. When he was within reach, he leaned down from the saddle, one hand gripping the reins and the other extended toward her. "Grab my hand! Now!" Beatrice reached up with fingers that barely worked anymore, and when his hand closed around her wrist, she felt the strength in his grip like a lifeline thrown from heaven itself. He pulled. She kicked against the water, and then she was rising, the current losing its hold on her as he hauled her up across the front of his saddle. She collapsed against his chest, shaking so violently she could barely breathe, and felt his arm lock around her waist as he turned the horse toward higher ground. The ride seemed to last forever and no time at all. She was dimly aware of him urging the horse forward, of the animal's powerful muscles bunching and releasing beneath them as it fought through water that reached its chest in places. She tried to speak, to thank him, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words, and her entire body felt like it was made of ice. "Stay with me," he said, his voice close to her ear. "We're almost there. Just stay awake." She forced her eyes open and saw that they had reached the edge of the flood, where the land rose up into rocky hills dotted with pine trees. The horse scrambled up the slope, and then they were clear, water streaming off them as the animal found solid ground. The cowboy kept riding, pushing on until they reached a small cabin tucked into a stand of trees, smoke rising from its chimney. He dismounted in one smooth motion and pulled her down after him, catching her when her legs buckled. "I've got you," he said, and then he was carrying her toward the cabin, kicking the door open with his boot. The warmth inside hit her like a physical force, and she gasped as he set her down in front of a cast iron stove that radiated heat. Her vision was blurring at the edges, but she could see him moving around the small space with quick efficiency, grabbing blankets from a trunk in the corner and what looked like dry clothes. "We need to get you out of those wet things or you're going to lose fingers and toes," he said, kneeling beside her. His face was clearer now in the lamplight, weathered and tanned with dark stubble along his jaw, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked to be in his late 20s, not much older than her own 22 years. "Can you manage yourself, or do you need help?" "I can try," Beatrice whispered, but when she tried to lift her hands to the buttons of her dress, they wouldn't cooperate. She let out a frustrated sob, humiliation mixing with fear and exhaustion. "It's all right," he said gently. "I'm going to help you, but I'll be respectful about it. My name is Samuel Sutton, and I give you my word as a gentleman that I'm only trying to save your life." She nodded because what choice did she have, and tried not to think about the impropriety of it all as he worked at the buttons of her dress with fingers that were surprisingly careful despite their obvious strength. He kept his eyes on his work, his jaw tight with concentration, and when he had the dress open, he wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders before sliding the wet fabric off her arms. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried using the stove for support and managed to get upright long enough for him to pull the sodden dress down past her hips. She was shaking so hard she nearly fell, but he steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch clinical and efficient as he helped her step out of the dress. Her undergarments were just as soaked, clinging to her skin, and she wanted to protest when he reached for the ties of her petticoat, but the words wouldn't come. She was too cold, too tired, too close to slipping into the darkness that kept pulling at the corners of her vision. He worked quickly, stripping away the wet layers until she was down to her chemise, and then he wrapped her in multiple blankets and guided her to sit in the wooden chair closest to the stove. "Better," he said, rubbing her arms through the blankets. "Now we need to warm you from the inside, too." He moved to the stove and poured something from a kettle into a tin cup, then brought it to her lips. "Drink this. It's just hot water with a little whiskey. It'll help." Beatrice sipped, wincing at the burn in her throat, but the warmth spreading through her chest was worth the discomfort. She drank more, feeling sensations starting to return to her extremities in painful prickles and stabs. "Thank you," she managed to say. "You saved my life." "Just happened to be in the right place," Samuel said, pulling up another chair and sitting across from her. He had taken off his own wet coat and hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and broad shoulders beneath a worn flannel shirt. "What were you doing out there alone in a winter storm?" "I didn't know there was going to be a storm," Beatrice said, her voice still shaky. "The weather was clear this morning when I left the last town. I was heading to Nebraska City for a teaching position that starts after the new year. I thought I could make it before nightfall, but then the clouds came in so fast and the creek that was supposed to be shallow turned into that monster." "The runoff from the mountains, Samuel said, nodding. "Happens sometimes in winter when the temperature rises fast and melts the snowpack. Then a cold front moves through, creates flash floods that can kill a person in minutes. You're lucky I was checking my trap line upstream, or I never would have heard you." "I didn't make any sound," Beatrice said, confused. "Your wagon overturning made plenty of noise. I was already heading that direction when I saw you in the water." He stood and moved to hang her dress and undergarments near the stove to dry. "You said Nebraska City? That's still a good 20 miles from here." "I know," Beatrice said softly. "I lost everything in that flood. My trunk with all my belongings, my papers, my books, even the money I had saved for lodging until I could collect my first wages." She felt tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She had not cried when the water was drowning her, and she would not cry now that she was safe. Samuel was quiet for a moment, studying her with those gray eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. "You'll stay here tonight," he said finally. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry. In the morning, I'll take you into town. Ridgeway Springs is only 5 miles from here, and they have a hotel and a general store. You can wire your family for help if you need to." "I can't impose on you like that," Beatrice protested, even though the thought of going back out into the cold made her want to weep. "You've already done so much." "You'll impose, and that's final," Samuel said, his tone brooking no argument. "I'll sleep out in the lean-to with my horse. You take the bed. There's stew on the stove from this morning, and I'll heat it up for us both. You need food in you after what you've been through." Beatrice wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was dragging at her like weights, and the warmth of the cabin was making her eyelids heavy. She watched through half-closed eyes as Samuel moved around the small space, ladling stew into wooden bowls and cutting thick slices of bread from a loaf on the counter. He brought the food to her, along with another cup of the whiskey-laced water, and sat across from her again. The stew was simple but good, venison and vegetables in a rich broth, and Beatrice ate mechanically at first and then with growing hunger as her body remembered it needed fuel. Samuel ate in silence, occasionally glancing at her as if to make sure she was still conscious and breathing. When they finished, he took the bowls and washed them in a bucket of water, then returned to check on her clothes. "These won't be dry until morning," he said. "I've got an extra shirt you can sleep in. It'll be big on you, but it's clean and warm." He retrieved the shirt from a chest at the foot of the bed, a dark blue flannel that looked like it had seen better days but was patched and mended with care. Beatrice took it, her fingers still clumsy with cold, and he turned his back to give her privacy as she shed the blankets long enough to pull the shirt over her head. It hung past her knees like a nightgown, and she wrapped the blankets around herself again, suddenly shy. "You can turn around," she said. When he did, something flickered in his eyes that might have been appreciation, or might have been simple kindness. "Bed's over there," he said, gesturing to the narrow cot against the far wall. "I'll bank the fire so it lasts through the night, and I'll be just outside if you need anything. There's a chamber pot under the bed if nature calls." "Thank you," Beatrice said again, because the words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this." "No repayment needed," Samuel said. He pulled on his still damp coat and retrieved his hat from the hook by the door. "Get some rest, Miss Calloway. Tomorrow will come soon enough." He left, closing the door softly behind him, and Beatrice was alone in the warm cabin with the crackling of the fire and the wind starting to howl outside. She made her way to the bed on unsteady legs and crawled beneath the quilts, which smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke and something else that was probably just Samuel himself. She should have felt awkward sleeping in a strange man's bed wearing his shirt, but instead she felt safer than she had in months. She closed her eyes and was asleep before she could form another coherent thought. Morning came with pale winter sunlight streaming through the single window and the sound of someone moving around outside. Beatrice woke slowly, disoriented, and sore in every muscle, and for a moment couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The flood, the cold, the cowboy who had pulled her from certain death. She sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her shoulders and the raw feeling in her throat. Her clothes were draped over the chair by the stove, still slightly damp but wearable, and she quickly shed Samuel's shirt and dressed herself, fumbling with buttons that were swollen from their soaking. Her shoes were in poor shape, the leather warped and discolored, but they were all she had. When she opened the cabin door, the cold air hit her face like a slap, but at least it wasn't the killing cold of yesterday's flood. Samuel was by the lean-to, saddling his roan horse with practiced motions. He looked up when he heard the door and nodded. "Morning, how are you feeling?" "Sore, but alive, thanks to you," Beatrice said. "I slept better than I expected to." "Good. I made coffee if you want some before we head out." He gestured toward the cabin where a pot sat on the stove. "We should leave soon if we want to make Ridgeway Springs by noon." Beatrice poured herself a cup of the strong black coffee and drank it standing by the stove, savoring the warmth. Samuel came in a few minutes later and did the same, and they stood in companionable silence, two people who had been strangers yesterday and were now bound together by circumstance and survival. "I don't have a saddle for you," Samuel said finally. "You'll have to ride in front of me again like yesterday. I know it's not proper, but it's the best I can offer." "I think propriety went out the window when you undressed me last night," Beatrice said, then felt her cheeks heat at how that sounded. "I mean, I'm grateful. You were a perfect gentleman. I just meant that I'm not worried about riding arrangements after everything else." The corner of Samuel's mouth quirked up in what might have been the start of a smile. "Fair enough. Finish your coffee and we'll go." The ride to Ridgeway Springs was nothing like the desperate flight from the flood. Samuel kept the horse to a steady walk, navigating through hills and valleys that were already showing signs of the previous day's deluge, with swollen streams and muddy tracks. Beatrice sat sideways in front of him, her body pressed against his chest for balance, and tried not to think about how aware she was of his presence, the solid warmth of him, and the way his arm rested lightly around her waist to steady her. They talked as they rode, the conversation coming easier than she expected. She told him about growing up in Ohio, about her father who was a clerk and her mother who had wanted all her daughters to marry well and produce grandchildren. She told him about her love of books and learning, and how she had scraped together enough money for teacher training by working as a seamstress for 3 years. She told him about her excitement over the position in Nebraska City, which would pay her $30 a month plus room and board, a fortune compared to what she could earn back home. Samuel listened without interrupting, occasionally asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested. When she finally ran out of words, she felt self-conscious about how much she had revealed and turned the conversation back on him. "What about you? Have you always lived out here?" "Not always," Samuel said. "I grew up in Kentucky on a farm that was too small to support all my father's sons. When I was 18, I headed west to try my luck in the gold fields, but that didn't work out. Spent some time working cattle drives, then found this piece of land and filed a homestead claim about 4 years ago. Been building it up bit by bit ever since." "Do you have family nearby?" Beatrice asked. "No, my parents are still in Kentucky and my brothers are scattered from here to California. I see them maybe once every few years when someone makes the trip." He paused, then added, "I was married once, briefly. She died in childbirth our first year together. The baby died too. A daughter." "I'm so sorry," Beatrice said softly, her heart aching for him. "That must have been terrible." "It was 5 years ago," Samuel said, his voice carefully neutral. "You learn to carry it and keep moving. Not much else you can do." They rode in silence after that, and Beatrice found herself thinking about this quiet cowboy who had lost so much and yet still rode out in winter storms to check his trap lines, who saved drowning strangers and gave them his bed and his food without expecting anything in return. There was a loneliness about him that she recognized because she felt it in herself, the sense of being set apart from the normal paths people were supposed to follow. Ridgeway Springs turned out to be a small town, maybe 20 buildings clustered around a main street, with a church at one end and a saloon at the other. Samuel guided his horse to a stop in front of a 2-story building with a sign that read "Hotel and Restaurant," and helped Beatrice dismount. "Get yourself a room and some proper food," he said. "The telegraph office is next door. You can wire Nebraska City and let them know you'll be delayed, or wire your family if you need money." "I have a little money left," Beatrice said, patting the small purse that hung from her belt and had miraculously stayed with her through the flood. "Enough for a few nights' lodging and meals, but not much more. I'll wire Nebraska City and hope they'll advance me enough for stage fare." Samuel nodded and started to turn away, and Beatrice felt a sudden panic at the thought of him leaving. "Wait," she said, catching his arm. "Will I see you again? To thank you properly?" He looked down at where her hand rested on his sleeve, then back up at her face. "I'll be around," he said. "I need to pick up supplies anyway. Maybe I'll see you before you head out." Then he tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving Beatrice standing on the wooden sidewalk feeling oddly bereft. The hotel proprietor was a plump woman named Mrs. Henderson, who took one look at Beatrice's bedraggled appearance and immediately bustled her upstairs to a small but clean room. "You look like you've had an ordeal, dear," she said sympathetically. "I'll have my husband bring up hot water for a bath, and you can tell me all about it over lunch downstairs." Beatrice gratefully accepted the offer, and within an hour she was soaking in a copper tub, washing away the mud and fear of the previous day. Her dress was a loss, she could see that now in proper light. The hem torn and the fabric stained beyond repair. She had no other clothes, no other belongings at all except the small purse, with its precious few coins and the memories of everything she had lost. After her bath, she dressed again in the ruined dress because she had no choice. then went downstairs to compose a telegram to the school board in Nebraska City. She kept it brief and factual. Caught in flood. Lost all possessions, will arrive as soon as possible, please advise. She paid for the telegram with money that she counted twice to make sure she had enough left for food and lodging, then returned to the hotel to wait for a response. Mrs. Henderson served her a lunch of chicken and dumplings and sat across from her, eager for the story. Beatrice gave her an edited version, leaving out the part where Samuel had undressed her, but including his heroic rescue and generosity. Mrs. Henderson's eyes grew wide at all the right moments. Samuel Sutton, you say? Oh, yes, I know him. Quiet man, keeps to himself mostly, but decent enough. Lost his wife years back, poor soul. He comes to town once a month or so for supplies and to sell his furs, then heads right back to that cabin of his. Never causes trouble, pays his bills on time. I'm not surprised he pulled you out of that flood. He's the type who would. Do you know when he'll be back in town? Beatrice asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Henderson gave her a knowing look. Probably tomorrow or the day after. If he's picking up supplies, why do you ask? I just wanted to thank him again, Beatrice said, feeling her cheeks warm. It seems inadequate, but I don't know what else to do. Honey, men like Samuel Sutton don't do things expecting thanks, Mrs. Henderson said. But I can see in your eyes that it's more than gratitude you're feeling, and I'll tell you right now to be careful with that. He's been alone a long time, and some men prefer it that way. Beatrice wanted to protest that she wasn't feeling anything beyond gratitude, but she knew it would be a lie. She had been thinking about Samuel all morning, about the way he had looked at her in the cabin, about the feel of his arm around her waist, and his voice close to her ear telling her to stay awake. She barely knew him, and yet she felt connected to him in a way that defied explanation. The response from Nebraska City came the next afternoon. The telegram was brief and formal. Position still available. Report January 5th. No funds available for advance. Beatrice read it 3 times, fighting back despair. She had less than $3 left, not nearly enough for stage fare to Nebraska City. She could try to find work here in Ridgeway Springs, save up enough money for the fare, but that could take weeks or months, and she would lose the teaching position. She could write to her parents and beg for help, but the shame of that was almost unbearable, and besides, they barely had money to spare themselves. She was sitting in the hotel dining room, staring at the telegram and trying not to cry, when the door opened and Samuel walked in. He was cleaner than yesterday, his hair still damp from washing and his face freshly shaved, and he wore different clothes, dark trousers, and a white shirt with a brown vest. He looked around the room until he spotted her, then walked over with that easy cowboy stride. Mind if I sit? He asked. Please, Beatrice said, grateful for the distraction from her troubles. He sat across from her, his hat in his hands, and studied her face with those perceptive gray eyes. You look like you got bad news. Not bad exactly, Beatrice said. The school board still wants me, but they can't advance me the money for stage fare, and I don't have enough saved to get there on my own. I'm trying to figure out what to do. Samuel was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. How much do you need? $15 for the stage, at least. And I should probably buy some basic clothes so I don't arrive looking like a vagrant. Say $20 total, maybe $25 to be safe. She laughed bitterly. I might as well say $100. I don't have it either way. I'll give you the money, Samuel said. Beatrice stared at him. What? No, I couldn't possibly accept that. You've already done so much. I'm not giving it to you as charity, Samuel said. It's a loan. You can pay me back when you get your first wages. I know you're good for it. You don't know anything about me, Beatrice protested. I could take your money and disappear and you'd never see me again. You won't, Samuel said, with such certainty that Beatrice felt something shift in her chest. You're not that kind of person, I can tell. Samuel, I can't let you do this, Beatrice said. But even as she spoke the words, she knew she was going to accept. What choice did she have? Why would you help a complete stranger like this? He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Because I want to, he said simply, and because I'd like to see you again after you're settled in Nebraska City. If you'd be amenable to that. Beatrice felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "I would be very amenable to that," she said softly. A smile broke across Samuel's face, transforming it from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip. "Then it's settled. I'll give you $30, which should be enough to get you there and buy what you need. You can repay me at $5 a month, or whatever you can afford. No interest, no rush, just a loan between friends." "Friends," Beatrice repeated, and wondered if that was really what they were becoming, or if it was something else entirely. Samuel left to complete his business in town, but he returned before dinner with the money he had promised, counted out in bills and coins from his own savings. He also brought her a small bundle that turned out to contain a ready-made dress from the general store, simple brown calico but clean and whole, along with stockings and a chemise and a shawl. Beatrice protested that it was too much, that the loan was enough, but he insisted she take them. "Consider it payment for saving me from an evening of my own cooking," he said. "Have dinner with me tonight." They ate in the hotel dining room, and Beatrice found herself laughing more than she had in months, as Samuel told her stories about his misadventures as a young man in the goldfields, about panning for weeks without finding so much as a flake and nearly starving before he gave up and took work on a cattle drive instead. He told her about learning to rope and ride, about sleeping under the stars and eating beans and bacon 3 times a day, about the men he had known and the places he had seen. "Do you miss it?" Beatrice asked, "the wandering and adventure?" "Sometimes," Samuel admitted. "But I like having my own land, building something that will last. The cabin's small now, but I plan to add on, maybe build a proper house eventually. And I've got good grazing land, enough to support a decent herd if I can save up to buy the cattle. It's a different kind of adventure, I suppose. Slower, but solid." "It sounds wonderful," Beatrice said, and meant it. "I've never had anything that was really mine except my books, and I lost those in the flood. Everything else has always belonged to my parents or been temporary lodging. I think I'd like to have a place that was permanent, somewhere I could put down roots." "You could do that in Nebraska City," Samuel said, "once you establish yourself as a teacher." "Maybe," Beatrice said, but she was thinking about his cabin in the hills, about the way it had felt like sanctuary when she was freezing and afraid. She was thinking about Samuel himself, and the way he made her feel seen and valued in a way that had nothing to do with how well she could sew or whether she would make a good wife for someone else's son. They talked until the dining room closed, and Mrs. Henderson started giving them meaningful looks, and then Samuel walked her upstairs to her room, a perfectly proper escort except for the way her heart was racing. At her door, he stopped and looked down at her, his expression serious. "The stage leaves tomorrow at 8 in the morning, he said. "I'll be here to see you off. Make sure you get on safely." "You don't have to do that," Beatrice said. "I know I don't have to. I want to." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingertips barely brushing her cheek, and Beatrice felt that touch all the way down to her toes. "Safe travels, Beatrice, and write to me when you arrive, so I know you made it." "I will," she whispered. "I promise." He left her there in the hallway, and Beatrice went into her room feeling like she was floating. She barely slept that night, her mind too full of thoughts about Samuel and the future, and everything that was changing so fast she could barely keep up. True to his word, Samuel was waiting outside the hotel when Beatrice came down the next morning, dressed in her new dress and carrying the small carpet bag that Mrs. Henderson had donated to her cause. He helped her up into the stagecoach, passed her bag to the driver to secure, and then stood there with his hand on the door frame looking up at her. "Remember, write to me," he said. "General delivery, Ridgeway Springs. I'll check for letters when I come to town." "I'll write every week," Beatrice promised, "and I'll send the first payment as soon as I receive my wages." "I'm not worried about the money," Samuel said. "I'm worried about you. Nebraska City is a rough town, and you'll be on your own there. Be careful, and don't let anyone take advantage of you." "I won't," Beatrice said. "I'm stronger than I look." "I know you are," Samuel said. "I saw that in the flood, how you fought. But promise me anyway." "I promise," Beatrice said, and on impulse she leaned down and kissed his cheek, feeling the rasp of his stubble against her lips. Thank you for everything, Samuel. I meant that. He stepped back as the driver called out and cracked his whip, and the stage lurched into motion. Beatrice pressed her face to the window, watching Samuel stand there in the street until they turned a corner and he disappeared from view. Only then did she sit back and let herself think about what she was feeling. This strange mix of excitement and loss and hope for something she couldn't quite name yet. The journey to Nebraska City took 3 days with overnight stops at way stations, and Beatrice spent most of that time thinking about what she would write in her first letter to Samuel. She composed a dozen versions in her head, trying to find the right balance between friendly and interested, grateful and independent. In the end, she decided to just be honest and let the words flow. Nebraska City was bigger than she expected, a bustling river town with steamboats on the Missouri and buildings that rose 3 stories or more. She found lodging at a respectable boarding house for women, met with the school board to confirm her position, and spent her first week preparing for the students who would arrive after the New Year holiday. The school was a simple one-room building at the edge of town, and she would be teaching children ranging from 6 to 14, about 20 students in total. On her first Sunday in Nebraska City, Beatrice sat down at the small desk in her room and wrote to Samuel. She told him about her safe arrival, about the school and the students she would soon meet, about the boarding house and the kind widow who ran it. She told him about the city and the river, about how different it was from the quiet countryside where his cabin stood. And then, because she couldn't help herself, she told him that she missed him and thought about him every day, that their brief time together had meant more to her than he probably realized. She sealed the letter before she could second-guess herself and walked to the post office to mail it, paying for the postage with coins that she counted carefully. Then she went back to her room and waited, hoping he would write back. His response came 2 weeks later, forwarded from the general store in Ridgway Springs. Beatrice's hands shook as she opened the envelope and unfolded the single page, written in a careful, slanting hand that looked like he had taken his time with each word. "Dear Beatrice," it began, "I was glad to receive your letter and know you arrived safely in Nebraska City. I have been thinking about you too, more than is probably wise for a man who only knew you for 2 days. But those were 2 days that changed something in me. And I find I don't want to go back to how things were before I pulled you out of that flood. I know it's too soon to say what this might become between us, but I would like to find out if you feel the same. Write to me again and tell me about your life there. I want to know everything. Yours, Samuel." Beatrice read the letter 3 times, her heart expanding with each word. She wrote back that same evening, and thus began a correspondence that sustained her through the long winter months. She wrote to Samuel every week, sometimes more often, and he wrote back faithfully with letters that grew longer and more revealing as time passed. He told her about his days at the cabin, about his dreams for the future, about the loneliness he had learned to live with but no longer wanted to keep. She told him about her students, about the joy of teaching and the challenges of managing a classroom full of children at different levels, about her own dreams of making a difference in their lives. By March, their letters had evolved into something unmistakably romantic. Samuel wrote things that made her blush and smile and read his words over and over again until she knew them by heart. He wrote about how he had never expected to feel this way again after losing his first wife, about how Beatrice had awakened something in him that he thought had died in the cold ground with his daughter. He wrote about wanting to see her again, about counting the days until school would let out for the summer, and she could visit if she wanted to. Beatrice wanted to. She wrote back and told him so, told him that she thought she was falling in love with him through these letters, and that she needed to know if what they had on paper would translate to reality. She was terrified of being disappointed, but more terrified of not trying. When school let out in mid-June, Beatrice had saved almost $40 from her wages after paying her boarding fees and sending money home to her parents. She set aside $25 for the loan repayment and travel expenses, then wrote to Samuel to tell him she was coming to Ridgway Springs for a visit if he would have her. His response came by telegram. "Unusual and expensive, but worth every penny. Come as soon as you can. We'll be waiting. Samuel." The stage ride back to Ridgway Springs felt longer than it had in January, but also sweeter because of what waited at the end. Beatrice pressed her nose to the window like a child, watching the landscape transform from river plains to rolling hills, counting down the miles until she would see Samuel again. She had changed since that winter day when he pulled her from the flood, grown stronger and more confident in her abilities, but she hoped he would still see the same woman he had written to so faithfully. When the stage pulled into Ridgeway Springs on a warm afternoon in late June, Samuel was there waiting. Beatrice saw him through the window, standing by his horse with his hat pushed back and his eyes scanning the stage, and her heart did a complicated dance in her chest. The stage hadn't even come to a complete stop before she was opening the door and climbing out, ignoring the driver's protests about waiting for the steps. Samuel caught her as she jumped down, his hands on her waist, and for a moment they just stood there looking at each other, half a year of letters and longing and uncertainty stretching between them. Then Beatrice reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the warmth of his skin and the reality of him. And Samuel pulled her close and kissed her right there in the middle of Main Street for everyone to see. It was nothing like the chaste kisses she had received from the few beaux she had entertained back home. This was hungry and desperate and full of all the things they hadn't been able to say in letters, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard and grinning like fools. "Hello," Beatrice said breathlessly. "Hello yourself," Samuel said, and kissed her again, softer this time, but no less meaningful. Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed the whole thing from her hotel porch, called out cheerfully, "I've got your old room ready, Miss Calloway, though I expect you'll be wanting to change that name before too long." Beatrice felt her cheeks heat, but she was still smiling as Samuel helped her retrieve her bag from the stage and escorted her to the hotel. They had dinner together that evening, barely tasting the food because they were too busy talking and looking at each other like they couldn't quite believe this was real. After dinner, Samuel suggested a walk, and they strolled through the quiet streets of Ridgeway Springs as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I want to show you something," Samuel said when they reached the edge of town. "Will you come with me?" "Anywhere," Beatrice said simply and meant it. They rode double on his horse, Beatrice seated in front of him with his arms around her, and traveled the familiar path to his cabin in the hills. But when they arrived, Beatrice saw that things had changed. The cabin looked bigger, and as they got closer, she realized he had built an addition, adding 2 rooms and a proper porch. "I started working on it in March," Samuel said as he helped her dismount. "I wanted to have more to offer you than just a 1-room cabin. There's a bedroom now, and a separate room that could be a study or maybe a nursery someday if you wanted. I built the porch so you could sit outside in good weather and read or watch the sunset." Beatrice walked up onto the porch, running her hand along the smooth railing that he had clearly sanded and finished with care. "You built this for me?" "I built it for us," Samuel said, "if that's what you want. I know it's fast, and I know we've only spent a handful of days together in person, but I'm certain about this, Beatrice. I'm certain about you. I want you to be my wife, if you'll have me. We can have a long engagement if you need more time, but I wanted you to see this and know that I'm serious about a future together." Beatrice turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it. The cabin and the future and being your wife. I don't need a long engagement, Samuel, I'm certain too. I have been since March, when you wrote to me about wanting to wake up next to me every morning and fall asleep holding me every night. I want that too. I want it all with you." Samuel closed the distance between them and kissed her again, and this time there was joy mixed with the passion, a sense of something being decided and settled and right. They stood on the porch as the last light faded from the sky, making plans and promises and sealing them with more kisses that left them both dizzy. "When do you want to get married?" Samuel asked eventually, his forehead resting against hers. "As soon as possible," Beatrice said. "I need to write to my parents and let them know, and I should probably give notice to the school board in Nebraska City. But I don't want to wait months, Samuel. I've already waited half a year to see you again." "We could marry here in Ridgeway Springs, Samuel suggested. "The preacher would do it, and Mrs. Henderson would probably be thrilled to host the wedding breakfast. Then you could take care of your obligations in Nebraska City, and I could finish preparing the cabin. You could come back in August, and we'd have the rest of the summer to settle in before winter." "That sounds perfect," Beatrice said. "Absolutely perfect." They were married a week later in the small church at the end of Main Street, with Mrs. Henderson and her husband as witnesses and half the town in attendance because news of the wedding had spread like wildfire. Beatrice wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her alter from a ready-made garment, and she carried wildflowers that Samuel had picked that morning from the hills around his cabin. Samuel wore his best suit, a little worn but clean and pressed, and he looked at Beatrice like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen as she walked down the aisle toward him. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional, but when Samuel kissed her as his wife, Beatrice felt like her whole life had been leading to this moment, to this man, to this future they would build together. The wedding breakfast at the hotel was a joyful affair with good food and dancing and well wishes from people who had come to care about both of them. And when it was over and they rode back to the cabin together, this time as husband and wife, Beatrice felt like she was finally coming home. That first night as Samuel's wife was everything Beatrice had hoped for and nothing like she had expected. He was gentle and patient, taking his time to make sure she was comfortable despite her nervousness. And when they finally came together, it felt like a natural extension of everything they had already shared through their letters and stolen moments. Afterward, lying in his arms in the bed he had built with his own hands, Beatrice thought about how she had almost died in a winter flood, and how that near death had brought her to this man and this life. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, his fingers trailing lazily up and down her arm. "About how lucky I am," Beatrice said. "About how you saved my life in more ways than one." "I think we saved each other," Samuel said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I was just existing before I met you, not really living. You changed that. You made me want things again, want a future with someone beside me." "I want that too," Beatrice said. "I want to build a life here with you, Samuel. I want to teach the children in the area, if there are any who need it, and help you with the homestead, and fill this cabin with noise and laughter and love. I want everything." "Then everything is what you'll have," Samuel promised. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret you," Beatrice said, and kissed him to prove it. She returned to Nebraska City the following week to fulfill her obligations to the school board, giving them notice that she would not be returning for the fall term and recommending another teacher to take her place. She settled her accounts, packed her few belongings, and said goodbye to the friends she had made during her months there. By mid-August, she was back in Ridgeway Springs for good, and Samuel met her at the stage with a wagon this time, ready to transport her trunk of books and clothes to the cabin that was now their home. The rest of that summer and into the fall, Beatrice and Samuel worked together to establish their homestead. She learned to cook on the cast-iron stove, to tend the vegetable garden Samuel had started, to preserve food for the coming winter. He taught her to ride properly, to help with the trapping and hunting that supplemented their income, to read the weather signs and prepare for storms. They talked about buying cattle in the spring, about clearing more land for crops, about all the ways they could improve their holdings. In September, Beatrice started a small school in their cabin, teaching the handful of children from neighboring homesteads who were within riding distance. She had 6 students ranging from 7 to 13, and she loved every challenging moment of it. Samuel built them desks and a bookshelf, and Beatrice used part of her savings to order primers and slates and other supplies. The children adored her, and their parents were grateful to have a teacher so close, often paying her in goods like eggs and butter and fabric rather than coin. By October, Beatrice suspected she might be pregnant. She waited another month to be sure before telling Samuel, nervous about how he would react given what had happened to his first wife and child. But when she finally worked up the courage to share the news one evening after dinner, he picked her up and spun her around, his face transformed by joy. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Beatrice asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Samuel said, setting her down carefully like she was made of glass. "Terrified, yes, but happy. So incredibly happy." Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you for this gift. They spent that winter preparing for the baby's arrival, with Samuel building a cradle from smooth pine and Beatrice sewing tiny clothes and blankets. The neighbors rallied around them, the women offering advice and hand-me-down baby items, the men helping Samuel make improvements to the cabin to ensure it would be warm and safe for a newborn. Beatrice continued teaching until March, when she became too ungainly to manage. And then she spent her days nesting and reading and knitting while Samuel hovered over her like a worried mother hen. The baby came in early May of 1875, a long, difficult labor that terrified Samuel and exhausted Beatrice, but in the end she delivered a healthy boy with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair like his father's. They named him Thomas, after Samuel's father, and Samuel held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect," Samuel whispered, his finger tracing the baby's tiny features. "He's absolutely perfect." "We made him together," Beatrice said weakly from the bed, exhausted but elated. "Our son." Samuel brought the baby to her, placing him carefully in her arms, and they marveled together at the miracle they had created. The midwife who had attended the birth bustled around cleaning up, offering instructions for care and feeding, but Beatrice barely heard her. She was too focused on her son, on the way his little hand curled around her finger, on the fierce rush of love that overwhelmed her. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and alert, and he brought a new dimension to their life on the homestead. Samuel proved to be a devoted father, taking his turn walking the floor when the baby cried at night, changing diapers without complaint, singing lullabies in a surprisingly good voice that made Beatrice fall even more in love with him. They established a routine, with Beatrice caring for the baby while Samuel handled the outdoor work, and in the quiet evening hours, they would sit together on the porch Samuel had built, passing Thomas back and forth between them while they watched the sunset and made plans for the future. That summer, Samuel made good on his plan to buy cattle, investing in a small herd that would form the foundation of their ranching operation. The work was hard and money was tight, but they were building something solid and lasting, a legacy for their son and whatever other children might come. Beatrice resumed teaching in the fall, bringing Thomas with her to the schoolroom and letting the older girls take turns minding him while she taught lessons. It was chaotic but joyful, and she loved every minute of it. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and small triumphs. A second child came in 1877, a daughter they named Grace, with Beatrice's dark eyes and Samuel's stubborn chin. She was followed by another son, James, in 1879, and then another daughter, Rose, in 1881. Their cabin grew with each addition, Samuel building new rooms as they needed them until it was a proper house with 6 rooms and a second story. The cattle herd expanded too, and Samuel hired a young cowhand to help with the work. The homestead became a small ranch, modest by some standards but thriving and debt-free, a testament to their hard work and partnership. Beatrice continued teaching, her small school growing as more families settled in the area, and Samuel served on the town council in Ridgeway Springs, respected by his neighbors for his integrity and good sense. Through it all, their love deepened and matured, changing from the passionate intensity of those early days into something richer and more enduring. They still made time for each other, stealing moments alone when the children were asleep or occupied, riding out together to check on the cattle or sitting on the porch after dinner to watch the stars come out. They talked about everything, from the mundane details of running a household and ranch to their hopes and dreams for their children's futures. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved books as much as his mother and showed an aptitude for ranching that pleased his father. Grace was wild and fearless, always climbing trees and riding horses at breakneck speeds, keeping both parents on their toes. James was the peacemaker, gentle and thoughtful, with a talent for music that surprised everyone. And Rose was still small, just learning to walk and talk, but already showing signs of being strong-willed like her mother. In the summer of 1883, Samuel and Beatrice celebrated their 8th wedding anniversary with a trip to Omaha, leaving the children with trusted neighbors for a week. It was their first time away together since Thomas was born, and they reveled in the freedom and romance of it, staying in a fancy hotel and eating in restaurants and taking in a theatrical performance. But their favorite moments were the quiet ones, lying together in a real bed with a feather mattress, talking about how far they had come since that day Samuel pulled Beatrice from the flood. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day?" Beatrice asked, her head resting on Samuel's shoulder. "If you had checked your trap line an hour earlier or later, and I had drowned?" "I try not to think about it," Samuel said, his arm tightening around her. "It's too terrible to imagine. But sometimes I do wonder if it was fate or providence or just blind luck that put me in the right place at the right time." "I think it was all three," Beatrice said, "and I think we were meant to find each other one way or another. Maybe not that exact way, but somehow. You saved my life, and I saved yours in return, and together we built something beautiful." "We did," Samuel agreed, "and we're not done yet. There's still so much ahead of us. Watching our children grow up, becoming grandparents someday, growing old together. I want it all with you, Beatrice. Every ordinary day and every special moment for as long as we have." "For as long as we have," Beatrice echoed, "which I hope is a very long time indeed." They returned home to 4 excited children who had missed them terribly, and life resumed its familiar patterns. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and blessings. There was a drought in 1885 that tested their resources and a hard winter in 1887 that killed several head of cattle, but they weathered these hardships together, supporting each other through the difficult times. There was also joy in abundance, the milestones of watching their children grow and learn, the satisfaction of seeing their ranch prosper, the deepening bonds of community as Ridgeway Springs grew into a proper town with a real school building and a doctor and a new church. Beatrice closed her small home school when Thomas was 10 and started attending the town school, but she continued to tutor children who needed extra help and served on the school board. Samuel expanded the ranch until it was one of the most successful operations in the county. Known for quality cattle and fair dealing, they became pillars of the community, respected and liked by their neighbors, but they never forgot where they came from or how they had found each other. On cold winter nights, when the wind howled around the house and the children were asleep upstairs, Samuel and Beatrice would sit by the fire and remember that December day in 1873 when fate had brought them together. They remembered the fear and the cold, the desperate ride through the flood, the warmth of the cabin that had been both sanctuary and beginning. They remembered the letters that had sustained them through their separation, the joy of their reunion, the leap of faith that marriage had required when they barely knew each other. "I would do it all again," Beatrice said one such night, her hand in Samuel's as they watched the flames dance in the fireplace. "Every cold, terrifying moment of it, if it meant ending up here with you." "Even the part where I had to undress you?" Samuel asked, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Especially that part," Beatrice said, laughing, "though I was mortified at the time. Now I just think how typical it was of you to be a perfect gentleman, even in those circumstances." "I was far from perfect," Samuel said. "I was terrified you would die anyway, that I had gotten you out of the water, but it would be too late. And I was angry at myself for thinking about how beautiful you were when I should have been focused on keeping you alive." "You thought I was beautiful?" Beatrice asked. "Even soaking wet and half dead?" "Especially then," Samuel said seriously. "You were fighting so hard to survive, and I could see the strength in you even through the fear. It made me want to know you, to understand what had made you that strong. And then when I got to know you, I found out you were even more remarkable than I had imagined." "You're going to make me cry," Beatrice said, blinking back tears. "Don't cry," Samuel said, pulling her close. "Or if you do, make them happy tears. Because I'm happy, Beatrice. After everything we've been through, all the hard times and the good times, I'm happier now than I ever thought possible. You gave me that. You and our children and this life we built together." "I'm happy too," Beatrice said, settling into his embrace. "More than I ever dreamed I could be. Sometimes I think about that girl who was traveling alone to Nebraska City to be a school teacher, and how different my life would have been if I had made it there safely. I would have been fine, probably. I would have had a good career and maybe eventually married someone suitable. But I never would have had this depth of love and partnership and purpose. I never would have had you. You have me, Samuel said, kissing the top of her head, for as long as we both shall live, and maybe even beyond that. I can't imagine existence without you in it, Beatrice. You're part of me now, woven into every thought and dream and hope I have. They sat in comfortable silence after that, content just to be together, listening to the wind and the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of one of the children stirring upstairs. This was their life, ordinary and extraordinary all at once, built on a foundation of near tragedy and rescue and a love that had proven strong enough to weather anything. The children grew up, as children do. Thomas went to college in Lincoln, studying agriculture and business with plans to come back and expand the ranch. Grace surprised everyone by becoming a nurse, drawn to helping people in their most vulnerable moments. Much like her father had once helped a drowning woman, James discovered he had a gift for music and began teaching piano lessons in town, bringing culture and beauty to the rough and tumble community. Rose followed her mother's path into teaching, showing the same patience and passion for education that Beatrice had always demonstrated. Samuel and Beatrice became grandparents when Thomas married a sweet-natured girl from a neighboring ranch, and they had a son named Samuel after his grandfather. Grace married a doctor she met during her training and settled in Omaha, but she visited often with her growing family. James married the daughter of the town banker, a girl who shared his love of music, and they made their home in Ridgeway Springs. Rose was still unmarried, focused on her career, but she had several promising suitors, and Beatrice suspected it was only a matter of time. As they aged into their 50s, Samuel's hair went gray, and Beatrice developed laugh lines around her eyes, but they were still active and involved in the ranch and community. They had built something that would last beyond their own lives, a legacy of hard work and love and faithfulness that their children and grandchildren would carry forward. The ranch was prosperous enough now that Samuel could afford to hire more help, giving him more time to spend with Beatrice, and they took advantage of that time to travel a little, visiting their children and exploring places they had never been. But their favorite place was still the ranch, the house that had started as a small cabin and grown room by room to accommodate their expanding family. They loved the view from the porch, the way the sun set over the hills where Samuel had once trapped and hunted, the peace of watching their grandchildren play in the yard, where their own children had played decades before. On their 25th wedding anniversary in June of 1898, their children threw them a party that brought together half the county. There was food and music and dancing, speeches and toasts and presents they didn't need but appreciated anyway. But the best moment came at the end of the evening, when everyone had gone home, and Samuel and Beatrice were alone on their porch looking up at the stars. 25 years, Beatrice said wonderingly. A quarter of a century since we stood in that little church and promised to love each other forever. It seems both longer and shorter than that. I know what you mean, Samuel said. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that I pulled you out of that flood. Other times I can barely remember what my life was like before you were in it. Do you have any regrets? Beatrice asked. Anything you wish had been different? Not a single one, Samuel said firmly. Well, maybe I wish I'd been braver in those first few days. I was so careful not to presume anything, not to rush you, but looking back, I wish I'd just told you right away that I was falling in love with you. I wouldn't have believed you, Beatrice said, laughing. I would have thought you were suffering from some kind of hero complex or that you felt obligated to me because you saved my life. I needed those months apart, writing letters and building our relationship on something more than gratitude and proximity. By the time I came back in June, I knew what I felt was real, and I knew you felt the same. That's true, Samuel acknowledged. And maybe that's why it worked. Because we took our time in some ways even though we rushed in others. We built a foundation strong enough to last. It did last, Beatrice said. It has lasted. And it will keep lasting, Samuel. Even after we're gone, this love we created will echo through our children and grandchildren. We made something immortal." "We did," Samuel said, pulling her close, "and I thank God every day that you ended up in that flood, and that I happened to be there to pull you out. Best thing that ever happened to me, saving your life, because in the process, you saved mine right back." They stood there together under the stars, the same stars that had looked down on them that first night in the cabin 25 years ago, and Beatrice felt a profound sense of contentment wash over her. This was what happiness looked like, what love looked like when it was tended and nurtured and protected through all of life's storms. This was the reward for taking a leap of faith, for trusting a stranger with her life and her heart, for building something worthwhile in the wilderness. The years that followed brought more changes. As time always does, Samuel slowed down, his joints stiffening with age, and eventually he turned over the day-to-day running of the ranch to Thomas, who had proven himself more than capable. Beatrice retired from the school board but continued to read to her grandchildren and teach them their letters, passing on her love of learning to a new generation. They traveled less, content to stay home and watch the seasons change from their beloved porch, receiving visitors rather than going out. But their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger as they grew older, refined by time into something pure and essential. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other good morning and good night, still found reasons to laugh together every single day. The children and grandchildren watched them with a mixture of admiration and amusement, seeing in their long marriage a model of what commitment and partnership could achieve. Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1907, 34 years after he pulled Beatrice from the flood. He was 78 years old, having lived a full and meaningful life, and he died in the bed he had built with his own hands. In the house he had expanded room by room, surrounded by evidence of the life he and Beatrice had created together. Beatrice held his hand as he slipped away, whispering words of love and gratitude, promising him that she would be all right, that their children would take care of her, that she would see him again someday. The grief was profound, but it was bearable because she had so many good memories to sustain her. She had decades of love to remember, of laughter and partnership and small daily kindnesses that had accumulated into a lifetime of happiness. She had children who loved her and grandchildren who adored her, and she had the ranch that she and Samuel had built together, physical proof that their love had created something lasting. Beatrice lived another 12 years after Samuel's death, dying peacefully at the age of 87 in the spring of 1919. Her children and many of her grandchildren were with her at the end, and her last words were about Samuel, about seeing him again, about the flood that had brought them together and the love that had sustained them through everything that followed. They buried her next to Samuel in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch with headstones that bore simple inscriptions. His read Samuel Sutton, beloved husband, father, and friend, 1829-1907. Hers read Beatrice Sutton, beloved wife, mother, and teacher, 1851-1919. But those who knew them best knew that the real monument to their love was not in the cemetery, but in the lives they had touched, the family they had raised, the community they had helped build, and the ranch that still bore their name and their legacy. Years later, their great-grandchildren would tell the story of how Samuel and Beatrice met, the dramatic rescue from the winter flood, the letters and the courtship, the marriage that lasted 34 years and produced 4 children, 13 grandchildren, and countless descendants who carried their strength and love forward into new generations. It became a family legend, the kind of story told around dinner tables and passed down through the years, a reminder that true love could arise from the most unlikely circumstances, that strangers could become soulmates, that a single moment of bravery and kindness could change not just one life, but many. The ranch prospered under Thomas's management and then under his sons, growing and adapting with the times, but never losing the essential character that Samuel and Beatrice had given it. The house stood for more than a century, sheltering generation after generation of their descendants, each one adding their own stories to the walls that Samuel had built and the rooms that had echoed with Beatrice's voice as she taught her children their letters and their grandchildren their prayers. And sometimes on cold December nights, when the wind howled down from the mountains and snow fell soft and silent on the hills, those who lived in the house swore they could feel the presence of Samuel and Beatrice, still together, still watching over the legacy they had created, still loving each other across the boundary between life and whatever came after. It was just a fancy, probably a romantic notion born of knowing their story and wanting to believe that such love could truly be eternal. But maybe it wasn't fancy at all. Maybe love like theirs did last forever, woven into the land they had worked and the house they had built and the hearts of every person who came after them, a living testament to the power of courage and faith and the kind of devotion that transforms two strangers into one unbreakable whole. The flood that had nearly claimed Beatrice's life became the flood that gave her everything worth having. The cold water that had threatened to drag her under became the crucible that forged an unshakable bond. Samuel's strong hand pulling her from certain death became the hand that held hers through every joy and sorrow that followed. The arm that steadied her when times were hard became the embrace that made her feel safe and cherished until the very end. What began in terror and desperation became a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments, that tragedy can transform into triumph, that being saved is sometimes just the beginning of a much larger story about two people who choose each other every single day and build something beautiful from that choice. And so the story lived on, passed down and treasured, a reminder to every generation that heard it that love is worth fighting for, that strangers can become family, that a single act of kindness can ripple out across decades and touch countless lives. Samuel and Beatrice's story became part of the fabric of their family's history, as essential and enduring as the land itself, a foundation on which new stories would be built, but which would never be forgotten or diminished by the passage of time. The winter flood of 1873 took many things from Beatrice Calloway that day, her wagon and her possessions and nearly her life itself, but it also gave her everything that mattered in the end. It gave her Samuel, and through him it gave her love and partnership and purpose. It gave her children and grandchildren and a legacy that would outlast them both. It gave her a life worth living, full of meaning and connection, and the kind of deep abiding joy that comes from building something worthwhile with someone you love. And that, more than any rescue or romance, was the true miracle of their story, the thing that elevated it from mere circumstance into something approaching destiny. Samuel Sutton rode through rising floodwater in winter and pulled Beatrice Calloway to safety, but in doing so he saved himself as well, pulling them both toward a future neither could have imagined but both desperately needed. They found in each other what everyone searches for, what many never find: a true partner, a genuine soulmate, someone who sees you clearly and loves you anyway, someone who makes you better just by being beside you, someone who transforms ordinary days into something extraordinary simply by sharing them with you. That was the gift the flood gave them, wrapped in fear and cold and near death, but precious beyond measure once they unwrapped it and understood what they had been given. Two lives that intersected for just a moment but stayed intertwined forever after. Two hearts that recognized each other despite every reason they shouldn't have. Two souls that found their home not in a place, but in each other. That was the real story, the one that mattered most, the one that their descendants would tell and retell until it became part of not just family history but family mythology, a foundational truth upon which everything else was built. And if you had asked Beatrice in those final moments of her life, as she prepared to leave this world and rejoin the man who had been her other half for so long, what she wanted people to remember about her story with Samuel, she would have said this: remember that love is possible even in the darkest moments. Remember that strangers can become family. Remember that being saved is sometimes just the beginning, not the end. Remember that the life you build together matters more than the circumstances that brought you together. Remember to be brave enough to take chances on people who see your worth. Remember to hold tight to the ones you love and never take a single day for granted. Remember that sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you leads directly to the best thing that ever happens to you. Remember all of this and pass it on so that no one ever forgets that love like this is possible, that stories like this are real, that happy endings exist not just in fairy tales, but in the lived experiences of ordinary people who make extraordinary choices. That was Beatrice's final gift to her family, the wisdom distilled from a life well lived and a love well earned, and it echoed through the generations like a promise and a challenge all at once. Live boldly, love deeply, build something that lasts, honor the people who came before by living up to the example they set. Take the gifts you are given, whether they come wrapped in tragedy or triumph, and use them to create beauty and meaning and connection. And when the winter storms come, as they inevitably will, remember Samuel riding through rising water to pull a drowning woman to safety. Remember Beatrice reaching up with numb fingers to grasp the hand that would change her life forever. Remember that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, and that the best response to being saved is to live a life worthy of that second chance. Their story was many things: dramatic rescue, an epistolary romance and frontier marriage, an enduring partnership, but most of all, it was a testament to the transformative power of love and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. The flood tried to take Beatrice's life, but instead it gave her everything worth living for. And that reversal, that transformation of tragedy into triumph, was the real magic at the heart of their story. Not the dramatic rescue itself, though that was certainly dramatic enough. But what came after? The slow, steady building of a life together, the accumulation of small moments into a grand love story, the way two damaged people made each other whole and then created something that would outlast them both. That was the miracle, and that was the message, and that was what made their story worth remembering and repeating and holding up as an example of what is possible when courage meets compassion, and when fate gives you a second chance and you have the wisdom to seize it with both hands and never let go. Samuel and Beatrice's love story began with cold water and fear and a cowboy's strong arm pulling a drowning woman to safety, but it blossomed into something far more profound and lasting than that dramatic beginning might have suggested. It became a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. It became a family legacy that would span generations. It became a community touchstone, a reminder of what was possible when people committed to each other and to building something worthwhile together. It became, in the end, exactly what love stories should be, a testament to hope and resilience and the enduring power of human connection in a world that often seems determined to tear people apart. And so their story ends where all good love stories should end, not with a dramatic climax, but with a quiet denouement, a peaceful conclusion to a life fully lived and a love fully expressed. Samuel and Beatrice rode off into many sunsets together over their decades of marriage, but the most important journey was not any single ride, but the long accumulation of days and years they spent side by side, building a life that honored both the dramatic way they came together and the steady commitment that kept them together through everything that followed. The flood was just the beginning. The love was everything that came after. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.